We're going to start now because all around the world, different time zones, people are tuning in to listen to our next speaker, and I can't blame them for doing that because I've heard him before and he's very good. Andy Burrows, currently, I knew Andy when he was a boy working at the NSPCC, but he's now with the Molly Russell Foundation, and he's going to talk to us about what the Molly Russell Foundation is doing in this space and what his views are on the policies that are being emerging. Go ahead, Andy.
Thanks, John. Yeah, before I had grey hair from starting to work on online safety. Thanks, John, and thanks everybody. So it's great to be able to share today Molly's story. The Molly Rose Foundation was set up following Molly's death in 2017, and for those of you that don't know her story, at her inquest in 2022, the coroner ruled that Molly died from an act of self-harm whilst experiencing depression and the negative effects of online content. And as far as we know, that was the first time anywhere in the world that a coroner's court had made that determination. So I want to share a little bit about Molly's story, not because that story sadly is unique or exceptional. We know that around a quarter of deaths by suicide among children aged 10 to 19 have an online element. We think that was around 48 children aged 10 to 19 in the UK every year. So we're talking about one internet-related death pretty much every week. In addition to just talk about Molly's story, I'll then briefly talk about some research that we've undertaken to give a sense of 7 years later, what, if anything, has actually changed. So many of you, particularly those of you based in the UK, will know that picture of Molly on the left hand of the slide there. You know, that I think is a picture that many of you will have seen on newspaper front pages, on TV broadcasts. It's become, you know, kind of really emblematic of the debates around online safety. But Molly, you know, was more than just the girl in that photograph. You can see there, she loved riding, she loved horse riding. She was part of a close family, grew up in Harrow in northwest London with two elder sisters. Molly's family remember her as endearing, as self-sufficient, as a quick learner. She was emotionally intelligent. There was no outward signs that Molly was experiencing the turmoil and the mental health distress that she was in the months before she died. So the weekend before Molly's death, the family celebrated the 18th and 21st birthdays of her two elder sisters, and Molly at the time was 14. She would have turned 15 later that month. Molly died the day before her middle sister turned 18. She'd already written her combined birthday and Christmas list. The night before she died, she'd attended the school play. Her and her dad had had a conversation about work experience opportunities for the following year. So there was really no outward signs of what was about to happen. That evening, the family sat down in front of the TV to watch that night's I'm a Celebrity. It was a perfectly normal evening in many respects. But Molly was found dead the following morning, the 21st of November 2017. And, you know, I can't imagine, knowing the family well, what the next few hours and days were like. But the next day, the Russells sat together and began a search really for answers as to what had happened that had led to Molly's death. And that was, you know, something that started around a family kitchen table and was the start of a journey that has taken the family to places where they had never anticipated in terms of some of the answers that they found, some of the questions that are still to be worked through, but also the real opportunity that comes from telling Molly's story. And it is a difficult one, but it's a really important one because it's from learning from experiences such as Molly's that we can try and tackle what is ultimately inherently preventable harm, and we must never lose sight of the fact that this is inherently preventable harm. And many of those answers do stem from Molly's online experience. We know it took, the inquest took almost 5 years to take place, and that was because of the many, many legal delays and tactics that were used by the companies to delay the date of that inquest. But we did eventually, from the data that was gathered, learn that Molly had engaged with more than 2,000 pieces of suicide and self-harm content in the months before she died. That figure is for Instagram alone. Algorithmic recommendation played a crucial role here, and it meant that the proportion of harmful content that Molly was seeing, that she was being algorithmically recommended, increased sharply in the weeks before her death. Now, some of that content breached the community standards of the platform. So some of this is a question of the platform's rules simply not being enforced as rigorously as they should. But a lot of this content is material that doesn't breach the community standards as they're currently drafted. And there is a big issue here around those community standards being drafted so narrowly that there's a significant amount of content, which perhaps in and of itself isn't harmful, but then if you are being recommended algorithmically large volumes of that, there is a potential for harm that comes from seeing that on a large cumulative basis, and that was so much of what we found. And one of the really disturbing parts of Molly's story, and it's something that is very much still in place today, is that this wasn't simply a question of the posts that Molly was seeing when she logged on to Instagram and Pinterest, the platforms which were particularly problematic in her case. It was also the notifications coming through on Molly's phone. It was emails that she was getting from Pinterest of 10 new depression pins that you might like. You've got a great eye. Here's more content that you might like. Those types of engagement tactics, Pinterest had pledged in their response to the coroner's report that they would phase out. But I can tell you, as of a couple of weeks ago, I was still getting those emails from an account that I used to undertake research that I'll talk about in a moment. Let's not lose sight then that this isn't just a consideration around content, but it's the systems and processes that result in what content we see and in what order that really is driving the harm. And of course, many of you in this room will know that this has been a long-term cat and mouse game with the companies. We know that Meta in particular has known a lot more than they've chosen to disclose around the harm that their platform design can cause. This slide references the reports that was leaked as part of the materials from Frances Haugen, the Facebook files, and as part of that research that showed that 13% of British users of Instagram who'd experienced suicide ideation had traced that to Instagram, and that it had made those feelings worse. These emails come from recent legal disclosures. So these emails stem from the case that's been brought by 41 state attorneys general against Meta. And these really are quite extraordinary. So many of you remember when Ian first told Molly's story publicly in February 2019, we saw, and it's probably the first time that I'd seen this, a round of crisis comms from Meta. The head of Instagram, Adam Mosseri, came over to the UK, and there was the genuflecting, there was the saying the right thing, saying that we'd got this and we would do better. 2 months later, these emails relate to a business case to create additional youth well-being capacity on Instagram. That top email is from Adam Mosseri. Unfortunately, I don't see us funding this from Instagram anytime soon. We recently ran a divestment exercise and are still too tight in a number of places. That's 2 months after he came over and gave a number of media interviews and said that he got it. I mean, I actually met him in person and he looked me in the eyes and, said, I get this, I'm going to fix this. That was the response 2 months later. One other thing that I think is worth saying, at that point, how many people do you think Instagram had working on youth well-being issues? Dozens? Hundreds? The answer that we know from those legal disclosures was 0.2 of a person. and no resource whatsoever on the product side. It's just extraordinary. So that was then, and in the years that have passed, we really wanted to take a sense check on what is the lay of the land today, how safer or otherwise are social networks. So late last year, to coincide with what would have been Molly's 21st birthday, we released a large-scale piece of research looking at the nature and the prevalence of harmful content, specifically harmful suicide content, self-harm content, and intense depressive content on Instagram, on Pinterest, and on TikTok. And this developed. This we intend to be the first in a kind of regular series of first in a regular series of pieces, so that we can track this over time. But the headline figures is that precious little has changed in the years since Molly died. And here's just some of the key findings. So we went through and identified the most engaged content on a series of hashtags, which we know are particularly problematic for sharing suicide and self-harm content. And then we coded them to see whether or not we classified them as harmful. You can see there around half of those posts on both Instagram and TikTok were harmful. And two main drivers here. As I touched on earlier, some of this is an enforcement piece, particularly when it comes to Instagram, posts that clearly promote and glorify suicide and self-harm, that the platform says do not belong on the platform, are not being taken down. But that much bigger problem, and this is particularly the case on TikTok, of content that has the potential for cumulative harm if you are being recommended post after post after post. And that is, probably the biggest driver of harm that we're seeing. And that's a really important finding for Ofcom, and we'll see, their consultation on the child safety duties in the next few weeks. And we very much hope that that point has been reflected in their recommendations. One of the things that I have to say really surprised me from our research, I'm not surprised that very little has changed. I'm not surprised that it's, still a massive problem in terms of harmful content out there. But the sheer magnitude of the algorithmic reach of harmful content, I have to say, surprised me, and it takes a lot to surprise me in this job these days. So, of those posts that we considered harmful, that we analysed, you can see there on TikTok, more than half of them had been viewed over 1 million times, and around 1 in 8 have been liked over 1 million times. So we are talking about a significant reach for this content. It's very, very clear when you look at the comments that the vast majority of engagement is coming from children. You can see there one Pac-Man style video, and I think you can probably see how this goes. Game over. There had 4.5 million views, 1.5 million likes. Of course, the commercial pressures, the battle for market share, is at the background of everything that we're seeing when it comes to how these platforms design and run their services. And it's really striking if you go on Instagram and you look at Reels, and we all know that, kind of Reels is in this battle for market share with TikTok. It's the short form video competitor. On the earnings calls, every single quarter you will hear the metric of time spent on Reels. 99% of the posts that we were recommended on an account where we'd trained the algorithm to show that we had an interest in these types of content were harmful. Meme after meme, slickly produced video content. Many of them a series of kind of meme, the same, meme formats referencing suicide ideation. And I'm giving you a lot of figures here, but I think almost one thing that I would say that I would encourage you to take away, as a researcher doing this, I had to be very proactive about my mental health and well-being. This stuff is claustrophobic, it is difficult, you know, kind of when you're engaging with huge amounts of this material, you know, it has an effect on you. And I'm, you know, hopefully a reasonably resilient early 40s man. What hope does a 13, 14-year-old girl have when being recommended this content because of just the negligence of platform design right now? And when we look in particular at Reels, we're looking at a problem that, because of commercial pressures and because of this battle for market share, is getting worse. It's not getting better. And this point around cumulative risk is really important. And when we're talking about algorithms, I think it's really important to recognize that this isn't simply the case of algorithms recommending a child harmful content, and that's that. Because very often that is the start of, you know, kind of broader, more complex harm pathways. And one of the things we were able to do in this research was then also to quantify, we think for the first time, how much of this material is not only, how often this content is not only engaged with, but then it's saved. And, you know, a case of Molly's story was, we know that she was able to binge watch large amounts of harmful material. You can see how a child experiencing mental distress or poor mental health may go and want to kind of binge watch this material. So a third of the posts that we considered harmful have been saved over 30,000 times. And if you follow through that pathway for harm, you know, a vulnerable child logs onto their device, the algorithms are recommending them substantial amounts of harmful content, they can be saved with a single click, and then there is a catalogue of harmful material that can be watched in volume, and no friction and precious little mitigations in that experience. It's very, very clear that the vast majority of people engaging with this content are children. And, you know, I would be really concerned about, you know, kind of the young people who are, you know, in that category of 30,000 plus saved for some of these posts. You know, they have been driven to huge amounts of harmful content. That is a really quick whistle-stop tour of Molly's story and of the state of play today. And the state of play is not a good one. It is now over to regulators and to legislators to drive change. So we've got grounds for optimism with the online safety regime in the UK, but it will be vital that Ofcom is frankly bolder and more ambitious than they have been to date. In the EU with the DSA and with opportunities around the age-appropriate code, and with progress in the United States as well. So there's signs of optimism, but this is a long and difficult road ahead. And, you know, I said this point at the start, but just to conclude, we are talking about inherently preventable harm. We should never be fatalistic about this. This is harm that stems from platform designs and from commercial decisions, and some of those emails I think are really, you know, illuminating and revelatory, but it's from those downwards that they translate into children's experience and the potential for harm.
Thanks a lot, Andy. So, any questions or comments? A point I've often made, and apologies therefore if you've heard it before, I've no doubt at all in my mind, if big tech had found a way of making more money by having a safer internet, they would have done it. They haven't. They've made a choice to run the internet the way it is because it produces a greater amount of money than alternatives do. So anyway, I'm glad to hear you're optimistic. A lot is resting on Ofcom and its interpretation of the new laws and the regulations it's going to produce. Has anybody got a question or a comment for Andy? Question or a comment on what he said? Yeah, go ahead.
In your own opinion, and I'm probably more pessimistic than you, unfortunately, and more in line with you, that I can't see the money drives the tech. I've got no interest in this, in making things safer for children. So, in your optimistic view, what, are we 5 years away from some sort of change? Because it's, in the last 5 years, nothing has improved. Are we, or is it longer, or, you know, just from your perspective?
I think that this is, a multi-year fight, you know, and I think it's essential and inevitable that we will see another Online Safety Act or further legislative strengthening in the first half of the next Parliament, because we've got an act and the framework of that, which is a good starting point, but it is a watered down version. It got, you know, kind of dragged into all the kind of messy Westminster politics of the last few years. So we'll need to see further legislative strengthening. This is a David and Goliath battle between those of us who want to see the platforms clean up their act and you know, the companies and their armies of regulatory lawyers. I think, you know, we need to hold the regulators' feet to the fire as much as we're holding companies to account to make sure that the frameworks that we've got in place are driving change. So, you know, this battle, I think, has more years to run, but I think we will win it. And because I think, you know, ultimately, there's so many parallels here to big tobacco, you know, and we saw exactly what the tobacco companies did around trying to delay the inevitable. And that's what we're seeing here, you know, and now we'll see attempts to skew the evidence base, you know, attempts to try and chill the regulators' risk appetite. But we've seen all those tactics and we know what they look like. So those dynamics are still really hard, but there's lots of learning that we can do. So, you know, it is a long-term battle, but I think we should be optimistic because ultimately, you know, we've seen in other really difficult sectors with other entrenched interests that, you know, we can win these battles.
Public opinion is on our side. Jutta?
Yes, thank you. Let me give you another more pessimistic example. So the European Commission have just held a consultation for preparing a level playing market field for the metaverse, for virtual reality and generative AI. Not a word was in there about children's rights, although they have the children's rights strategy for the next 5 years. So the only purpose of that was preparing the commercial success for companies in that field. So I would say we could be successful if our voices are more loudly heard to say, okay, if we are preparing for a new market in virtual reality, where obviously these things that you've been describing will be at present and will be available for children, then why not do child rights design from the beginning, having a risk assessment before preparing for a competitive market without taking into account children's rights?
And it does feel really frustrating, doesn't it, that whether it's, you know, the metaverse technologies or whether it's Gen AI, it feels like history repeats and we have to make some of those first principle arguments again. Maybe there's a reflection for us about how, as a sector, we can make sure that we've got, you know, the kind of capacity and voice that can kind of start to take on the privacy lobby, the corporate lobbies, and, you know, manage some of those asymmetries. It's hard because there's not enough of us, but, you know, how can we, you know, start to equalize that playing field?
We've got to end it, I'm afraid, because people are logging in from all over the world. We have to be strict on time. If you catch Andy later with your question. No? Okay, thanks a lot, Andy.